Now, you have heard testimony about whether Potter's decision to use her taser was reasonable or appropriate. The judge has given you a definition of reasonable force, reasonable use of non-deadly force, in case you want to consider that testimony and the legal requirements about her decision to use a taser. Mr. Gray, I guess, criticized us for putting in evidence about the crash and the Lundgrens. Here in this trial, that testimony was offered to you to show exactly what officers are trained to think about collateral danger, right? Shooting somebody who's in a position to operate a vehicle, officers have to think about that. And that's exactly what happened here, except Officer Potter did it with her gun by shooting Dante right in the chest. That's why that evidence was offered. When you consider the defense argument, incidentally, here for a moment, think about criticizing us for putting in evidence that has relevance to the issues. But the defense put in character evidence about Miss Potter and concluded with that, arguing to you that she's a good person. What's the relevance of that testimony? She may be. What's the relevance to the issues in this case? Mentioning that Mr. Gannon was a Marine, and I think...
object to that. Obviously, character evidence is relevant.
The objection is overruled.
Mr. Gannon, who served as a Marine, and I thank him for his service, I'm sure we all do, and it's impressive. He pointed it out to you today. What's the relevance of that testimony? Anyway, ultimately, you really may not have to decide whether her decision to try to use a taser was reasonable, because that is not a defense to the charges. It's right in the judge's instructions. It's not a defense because the conduct at issue in this case is firing the gun that killed Dante Wright. Whether her decision to use a taser was reasonable, appropriate, wise, may be considered by you to determine, based on the totality of circumstances, her entire course of conduct. But it is not a defense to her use of deadly force, what she actually used. I'm going to address the issues raised in the defense argument in slightly different order. We'll first talk about the argument about using deadly force. Counsel says you can acquit her because she could use deadly force. This is primarily based on a contention that Sergeant Johnson was in a position to fear. Well, what's required is that there be evidence of an apparent belief of death or great bodily harm. This claim is simply wrong based on all the evidence in the case. Her conduct, the facts that would have been known to her, and her testimony. This defense argument about the use of deadly force, when she has said at the scene she did not mean to use deadly force, is a justification, an after-the-fact justification to avoid consequences she acknowledged immediately out there on the street. The judge has told you to use your common sense in deciding the issues and the believability of witnesses. Common sense tells us all that often when people try to make up justifications later for things they have done, the justifications fall apart because they just can't line up with the facts. The facts exist. You have seen them. And if they can't be hidden or obscured, they render the justification incredible. Here's a simple illustration, I think, of what I mean by that. Ms. Potter wants you to believe that Mr. Wright was not in a position to operate the vehicle so as to justify her use of the taser. Because if he's not in a position to operate the vehicle, it's okay to taser him. I brought in Mr. Imes to tell you that. And they had people say, well, he wasn't in a position to operate the vehicle. But yet, they also, Ms. Potter wants you to believe that he was in a position to operate the vehicle to justify deadly force to protect Sergeant Johnson and Officer Lucky. Those things are inconsistent. And that's the problem with trying to create justifications later. Now, which is it? The evidence will tell you which it is. Ms. Potter did not believe that the use of deadly force was necessary to protect anybody. She just wanted to keep Dante Wright from fleeing a traffic stop her probationer had initiated. Mr. Gray is right. The state has to prove that Ms. Potter's use of deadly force was not authorized. He's right. That's our burden. You'll see that in the instruction, plain as day. That instruction also says that deadly force is authorized only if a reasonable officer, knowing what the officer knew at the time of using force, would have believed deadly force was necessary to prevent great bodily harm or death. Potter's assertion now that she could have used deadly force to protect the officers is simply not supported by the evidence. First, consider the testimony from Lucky, Johnson, even if you will, Flesland, Gannon. Those statements, that testimony, simply lacks credibility. Look at the videos. You believe your eyes. Look at the videos. Watch them in real time. That's fine. I encourage you to do that. We slowed them down so you could understand what's happening there. But sure, watch them in your own time. I agree with that. But you can believe what you see in those videos. What you see in those videos is Dante Wright never assaulted these officers. The characterization of fighting and struggling is not supported by the evidence. Those are just terms used, not supported by the evidence. He was trying to flee, no doubt about it. But he was not struggling or fighting with these officers. He simply pulled away, tried to operate the car. He never even threatened the officers. Nobody has disputed those facts. You saw in the video during the testimony of Sergeant Johnson that he had control of the car and Dante Wright. He reached in, tall man, standing firmly on the ground next to the car, leaned against Elena Albrecht Payton, who obviously didn't put up any resistance to an officer of his size, didn't put up any resistance, just leaned against her, put his right hand on the shift knob, and you can watch that video and see Dante Wright's hands reaching for the shift knob, but he can't move it because Sergeant Johnson has control of that shift knob, and he's reaching up to shut the car off. During that time, Sergeant Johnson says something to Elena Albrecht Payton, something like, "Just stay back." Listen to the calmness in his voice. You know, is that the voice of an officer with a look of terror on his face that a 26-year police veteran had never seen before? Then, Sergeant Johnson stays in the vehicle, not in the vehicle, leaning in, and he takes his hand off the shift knob and is able to grab Dante Wright's right arm with both of his hands and pulls Mr. Wright's right arm over in front of Elena Albrecht Payton in the passenger seat. He's not concerned about being dragged. He's subduing Dante Wright. And he's doing that because he assumes Lucky on the other side is going to grab the other arm and they're going to be able to handcuff him. That's what his testimony was. Ms. Potter's trying to make much of Johnson's testimony. Remember that these were leading questions put to fellow officers. I'm not saying officers lie. The judge will instruct you when considering the believability and weight to give testimony. Think of the relationship between the parties. These were leading questions put to Officer Johnson. His question was, what would have happened with you halfway in the car? That's my recollection of the question. Rely on your own. Sergeant Johnson wasn't halfway into the car. At the time of the shot, he was all the way over to the passenger side, securing Mr. Wright's right arm. He had control over Dante Wright. The only time Sergeant Johnson became concerned is when Potter used her taser, said she was going to use her taser. Recall that Officer Lucky testified, and with rapid succession of leading questions, they asked him, well, if you had been in the car, you could have been dragged and hurt. He said, yeah. Well, remember again, that's a hypothetical question. And what the real evidence is that Officer Lucky was standing outside the car. At most, he reached an arm into the car. He tried to grab a hold of Mr. Wright. At one point, he tried to grab the steering wheel or the steering column. He's standing outside of the car, his feet on the ground. He's no more in the car than Potter was. Recall that counsel asked him, as far as you knew, Johnson was in the car. Lucky dutifully agreed with that.
Judge, I object to this. I didn't go into this testimony.
The objection is overruled.
For the record, Your Honor.
No.
But during that time, Potter is on the other side of the car from Sergeant Johnson, sometimes behind Officer Lucky. Recall Officer Potter saying she's 5'3". Look at the video. Yeah, her body camera's down here, and her eyes are up here, but she's only as tall as the car. So counsel pointed out, you know, we're talking about the body cam, we're showing you the body cam. Yeah, but her eyes aren't going to be any better perspective of Sergeant Johnson. Just look at the video, see where she lines up with that car. And you heard Dr. Miller talk about hyperfocus. Well, if she had this kind of tunnel vision hyperfocus during this chaotic scene, how did she see Sergeant Johnson's face with this look of terror? The bottom line, factually, is that the opinions of Lucky, Johnson, for that matter, Fleslin, Peterson, Gannon, on which she bases her factual claims, were offered on leading hypotheticals, not the actual facts of the case. This is particularly true of Fleslin, Peterson, Gannon. Fleslin and Peterson only watched brief snippets of the video. Right? They didn't review all of the evidence in the case. Seth Stoughton did. They didn't interview witnesses. They admitted to you all. They were just offering opinions on hypotheticals from Ms. Potter. Mr. Gannon indicated that he watched Ms. Potter's body-worn camera that night and immediately concluded this was an accident. Right or wrong, he believes he was fired for it. But then anyways, at the request of the defense, he then went and watched the squad camera. And that was all. The squad camera's perspective is behind the Buick, the white car, and a little off to the driver's side. It's not a good perspective of Sergeant Johnson's position. The fact is, Gannon didn't even watch Sergeant Johnson's body-worn camera. You have. The facts simply don't support these assertions, but more importantly, these assertions don't even address the proper legal argument you have heard. You will read in the judge's instructions that the standard is what a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have known. Not one of those witnesses tried to explain that to you. Not one of them have offered an opinion that it would have been apparent to Officer Potter. Second, I want you to consider the sources of these assertions. Again, the judge has told you in her instructions that when you consider the believability and weight to give to witnesses, consider the interest in the outcome of the case, the witness's interest in the outcome of the case, and the reasonableness in light of other evidence, as well as the relationship of the witness to the parties. These officers were part of her police family. She called it that herself. They worked with her for many years. They relied on her. She relied on them. They were backup for her and vice versa. They liked the things she did. The honor guard. You know, I think we can all like that, right? I mean, that's good stuff. That's she did, no doubt about it. The domestic abuse response team, that's good stuff, right? And they all spoke highly of her for it. On the other hand, Professor Seth Stoughton is not a part of Officer Potter's police family. He did work as a police officer. He worked as a licensed investigator. Then he went to law school. And since then, he has become an expert in policing. He teaches at a law school. He researches issues related to policing. He publishes extensively. And he speaks to all groups about these issues, not just police groups. Potter kept referring to him as the $95,000 guy or the $93,000 guy. That's not what he charged in this case, right? He testified on the stand. He's so far charged something like $9,000. Yeah, he's an expert witness. He gets paid. He can get paid $95,000. Why use that term? Just going to distract you from the reality. He took the stand anyway, Seth Stoughton, and explained in great detail for you in his own words, not mine, the evidence he believes shows that Potter did not have a reasonable belief that some officer was in danger of death or great bodily harm. He explained the bases for his opinions properly in terms of what a reasonable officer would have known at the scene, the proper legal standard, and he explained it, and he was subject to cross-examination about it. Mr. Imes, on the other hand, who has spent his entire career completely immersed in police organizations, dedicated his life to it, told you that, can't remember if he said 110% or more than that, simply offered a short opinion. Not accepting a fee for his services because that's how important it is, he still was not sure if he had reviewed all of the materials when he wrote his report. He wrote a report that was just over 2 pages in length, and he did not even consider Potter's use of deadly force until after the trial started and the defense brought it up to him through Sergeant Johnson's testimony. Yes, he drove up here. That's how much he cares. But he didn't even know if he had reviewed all the material. Didn't even think about deadly force until it was brought up later. Tim Gannon.
The objection is overruled.
I think I already talked a little bit about Mr. Gannon. I would point out here, he too made no attempt to offer a basis for his opinion, certainly not at length. Didn't even watch Sergeant Johnson's body-worn camera video. An interesting thing also, incidentally, that I want to point out, Commander Grunig and then Chief Gannon authorized the BCA to come in and investigate the case. And why is that? To avoid any appearance of bias.
Judge,
Right.
I never mentioned the BCA. It's improper
The
report.
objection is overruled.
And so they recognize in bringing the BCA in to investigate the potential for bias of fellow officers. You should feel free to consider then that recognition